the first warning should have been the windows. I had ordered black-framed, energy-rated windows for the little 1940s bungalow on Maple Bend Road, the first house I had ever owned, the house I bought after 6 years of drafting other people's kitchens, roof lines, and porch additions for an architectural firm in Knoxville. Those windows were supposed to arrive on a Friday morning. I knew because I had created the renovation schedule myself, color-coded by trade, delivery date, inspection stage, and bank draw requirement. But when I drove past my property after work, the bungalow still had warped white wooden frames, cracked glass, and blue painter's tape flapping in one broken corner. The dumpster was empty. The porch was untouched. No crew, no sawdust, no delivery tags, no windows. Just my house sitting there in the evening light, like nobody had loved it enough to begin. I called my father from the driveway. He answered on the third ring, cheerful in the way he got when he already had a story ready. "Avery, sweetheart, don't panic." The schedule shifted. I looked through the dusty front window at the bare studs where the kitchen wall had been opened 2 weeks earlier. Shifted where nothing is here. He sighed, like I was being dramatic before receiving the full lesson. Construction is never exact. That's why your mother and I offered to help manage it while you're busy. Help manage it. That was what they called it when they asked for access to my contractor portal, copies of my bank draw schedule, and permission to coordinate deliveries because my job had me on site visits 3 counties away. I was 28, not helpless. But I had wanted to believe my parents were proud that I had bought a house without asking them for money. I wanted to believe help meant help. My mother took the phone from him. "Honey, you need to trust the process. Your father has been talking to Rick." Rick Donnelly was my general contractor, a friend of my father's from church, and the man who had promised he could turn the bungalow into a clean 2-bedroom home with a restored porch, new roof, updated electrical, and a small drafting nook where the old laundry room used to be. The budget was tight but manageable. $186,000 purchase price, $92,000 renovation loan, and a draw schedule controlled by Appalachian First Bank. Every draw had to match completed work, invoices, and inspection photos. That was the part that made my stomach tighten. If nothing had happened at my house, why had the bank already released the second draw? "Mom," I said carefully, "the windows are not here. The framing inspection has not happened. Why did Dad tell me Rick needed the second draw released?" She went quiet for half a second too long. Then she gave a soft laugh. "You always get so technical. Materials get stored off-site all the time." I stared at the cracked glass in my front window. "Off-site where?" My mother's voice sharpened under the sweetness. "Avery, your father is trying to save you money. If you start questioning every little thing, contractors won't want to work with you." There it was, the family rule. If I asked for facts, I was difficult. If my younger sister Madison asked for help, she was overwhelmed. If my parents crossed a boundary, they were loving. If I noticed, I was ungrateful. I hung up and drove to Madison's new property before I let myself think too hard. She and her fiancé had bought a half-acre lot outside Maryville, or at least they said they were planning to build someday once money made sense. Madison was 25, beautiful, charming, allergic to consequences, and somehow always 5 minutes away from a family emergency that required my parents' checkbook. When I turned onto Cedar Hollow Lane, I saw a new construction frame rising where there had been empty grass 2 months earlier. It was not a huge house, but it was more than a starter shell. Fresh sheathing, Wrapped exterior, roofing underlayment, and a stack of black-framed windows leaning beside the garage opening. My windows. Same brand, same size labels, same delivery code I had entered into my renovation spreadsheet. I parked behind a white pickup and got out slowly. The evening air smelled like cut lumber and wet clay. A subcontractor I recognized from Rick's crew was loading scrap into a trailer. He froze when he saw me. "Miss Lawson," he said, too quickly. "This isn't Maple Bend," I said. He looked toward the house, then back at me. "Rick said you knew." My pulse slowed in a way that scared me. "Knew what?" He wiped his hands on his jeans. "That some materials were being redirected temporarily. Family project. Same account." Same account. I took out my phone and photographed the window labels, the lumber tags, the wrapped pallets near the garage, and the temporary power permit taped near the front. The permit did not list Madison. It listed Lawson Residential Renovation Support, a project nickname I had never approved, with Rick Donnelly as contractor and my parents' home address as billing contact. Madison came out of the framed doorway wearing leggings, a cream sweater, and an expression that tried to turn guilt into confusion. "Avery, what are you doing here?" I held up my phone. "Looking for my windows." Her face changed, but only for a second. Then she smiled the way she smiled when borrowing clothes she never returned. "Oh my gosh, don't start. Dad said it was just a timing thing." I looked past her at the house shell. "A timing thing built 3 walls and a roof." She crossed her arms. "You don't understand. Our lender delayed our approval, and Mom said your renovation had flexibility. You don't even live there yet." I almost laughed. "Because it's not renovated." Madison rolled her eyes. "Exactly. You can wait. I'm getting married next spring." That sentence told me everything. Not the bank paperwork, not the invoices, not the contractor's nervous face. That sentence. You can wait. I'm getting married. In my family, Madison's milestones were emergencies. My plans were resources. My parents had not stolen from me because they hated me. They had done it because they believed my patience was an account they could overdraw forever. My father arrived 10 minutes later, probably called by Madison the second I stepped onto the lot. He got out of his truck, red-faced and angry, but not surprised. "Avery, get in your car." I did not move. "Did you use my construction loan to buy materials for Madison's house?" He pointed toward the road. "This is not the place." "It looks like exactly the place." My mother pulled in behind him and rushed to Madison, not me. That small thing hurt more than I expected. She stood in front of my sister like Madison had been attacked by facts. "Avery, lower your voice." I looked at her. "I haven't raised it." My father stepped closer. "You approved Rick coordinating family projects?" "I approved Rick managing my renovation," he said. "The funds are all being balanced." I asked, "Against what invoice?" He did not answer. Then my phone buzzed. An email from Appalachian First Bank. Subject: Final draw inspection scheduled. I opened it while my family watched me, and my mouth went dry. The bank inspector was scheduled to visit Maple Bend Road the following Monday to confirm completion of framing, window installation, roof dry-in, rough electrical, and plumbing progress before releasing the third draw. My house had none of those things. Madison's house had most of them. My mother saw my expression and reached for my arm. "Avery, don't do anything rash." I stepped back before she touched me. Rash would be signing another draw request. My father's face went pale. Photographers possessed. What does that mean? I looked at the black-framed windows leaning against her unfinished garage and said, "It means the bank is about to inspect the wrong lie." I did not argue with them on Cedar Hollow Lane, because the evidence was standing behind Madison in stacks of lumber and black-framed windows. My father kept saying we could work this out as a family, which meant he wanted me to leave before a neighbor asked why my construction materials were sitting beside my sister's unfinished garage. My mother kept telling me not to embarrass Madison, which was strange because nobody seemed worried about embarrassing me in front of a bank inspector. Madison folded her arms and said, "You're acting like I stole your house." And I looked at the roofline behind her and said, "No, Madison. You just let them build yours with my loan." Her face twisted, but she did not deny it. That was enough for me. I photographed the permit sheet, the window labels, the contractor truck, the lumber tags, and the exterior wrap before I got back in my car. My father followed me to the driveway and lowered his voice. "Avery, if you report this, you'll destroy your sister's future." I looked at him through the open window and said, "You should have thought about that before you used my name to finance it." When I got home, I did not call Rick, my contractor. I did not call the bank right away either. I knew better than to walk into a financial mess with only anger and photos. I opened my renovation folder and laid everything out on my kitchen table: the construction loan agreement, draw schedule, contractor contract, material invoices, inspection requirements, and every email my parents had sent after I gave them limited access to coordinate deliveries. Limited access. That phrase mattered. I had allowed my father to be copied on delivery updates because I was traveling for work. I had not authorized him to approve draw requests, redirect materials, move labor, or change the project address. The loan was secured against Maple Bend Road. The work had to happen at Maple Bend Road. If funds were being used at Cedar Hollow Lane, that was not a family misunderstanding. That was loan misuse. The first invoice that looked wrong was from Volunteer Building Supply. It listed 8 black-framed windows, roof underlayment, framing lumber, and exterior wrap. The billing code matched my bungalow renovation, but the delivery confirmation showed site received by D. Lawson. My father's name was Daniel Lawson. The delivery address line had been shortened to Lawson Residential, with no street visible in the copy Rick had forwarded me. I opened the bank portal and checked the second draw request. Rick had submitted progress photos showing framed walls, roof dry-in, and window staging. At first glance, the images looked like any construction site, but I zoomed in and saw the hillside behind the frame, the gravel curve of Cedar Hollow Lane, and Madison's fiancé's blue Jeep half visible behind a dumpster. My bungalow sat on a flat city lot with a chain-link fence and a maple tree in front. The bank had released money based on photos from the wrong property. My hands shook then, but only for a few seconds. After that, I became very calm. I saved the draw request, downloaded the photos, exported the invoice records, and created a folder named Maple Bend Loan Evidence. Then I emailed myself a timeline: first draw for demolition at my house, second draw requested after framing progress, windows missing from Maple Bend, materials found at Cedar Hollow, bank final draw, inspection scheduled for Monday. I included every date, every amount, every person copied. It was the kind of timeline I used at work when a client changed a plan and later pretended they had not. Drawings taught me that truth needs dimensions. Documents taught me that betrayal needs dates. Rick called at 8:42 p.m. I let it ring once before answering. His voice was too casual. Avery, your dad said there was a little misunderstanding. I looked at the invoice open on my laptop. Where are my windows? He sighed. They're safe. That's not an address. He tried a laugh. Materials move around. It happens. Not across two different properties under one construction loan. Silence. Then his voice dropped. Your dad said you were okay with helping Madison temporarily. He said the family was balancing it out. I asked, did I ever put that in writing? He did not answer. Rick, did you submit Cedar Hollow progress photos to Appalachian First Bank under my Maple Bend draw request? He said, Avery, be careful how you phrase things. That told me more than a confession would have. Innocent contractors explain. Guilty contractors warn you about phrasing. I ended the call and sent Rick one email. Please confirm in writing the current location of all materials purchased under my Maple Bend Road construction loan, the street address where the second draw progress photos were taken, and who authorized any work or delivery outside the contracted property. He did not reply. 5 minutes later, my father called twice. My mother called once. Madison texted, You're making everyone panic over something Dad was going to fix. I answered none of them. Then my father emailed, and that was the first real gift of the night. Avery, nobody stole from you. We only shifted resources for a few weeks because Madison's build hit a financing delay, and your place had flexibility. Rick knows how to balance draws. Don't involve the bank and make this ugly. I stared at the words, shifted resources, until they burned into my head. Then I saved the email into the evidence folder. The next morning, I took a personal day from work and drove to the county permit office. I did not announce myself to my family. I did not warn Rick. I asked for the public permit files for Maple Bend Road and Cedar Hollow Lane. The clerk, a woman named Paula, who had seen every kind of construction mess in East Tennessee, pulled both files and slid them across the counter. Maple Bend showed demolition approval and rough framing pending, no window inspection, no roof dry-in approval, no rough electrical. Cedar Hollow, however, showed active framing, roof dry-in, temporary power, and a contractor of record, Rick Donnelly. The owner listed was Madison Lawson and Evan Pierce, but one attachment made my stomach drop. Under supporting documents, someone had uploaded a material allocation sheet using my Maple Bend project code. I asked for certified copies. Paula looked at me over her glasses. You involved in both projects? Only one, I said. She stamped the document slowly, then said, Then you may want to bring these to whoever is funding the one you're involved in. I almost smiled at how carefully she said it. That's the plan. Before leaving, I asked whether any inspection had been requested for Maple Bend. She checked her screen. No rough framing inspection requested yet. Only bank inspection listed through a third-party inspector next Monday. That meant the county knew my house was not ready, but the bank draw photos claimed progress that did not exist. The gap was no longer emotional. It was official. At noon, I called Appalachian First Bank and asked for the construction loan officer assigned to my file, Karen Whitlock. When Karen came on the line, I kept my voice steady. I need to report a potential misuse of construction funds and incorrect progress documentation tied to my loan. The silence on the other end was short but sharp. Are you saying work billed to your property may have been performed elsewhere? Yes, I said. I have photos, invoices, permit records, and draw request images that appear to show my materials and labor at another address. Karen stopped sounding like customer service and started sounding like risk management. Do not sign or approve any additional draw request. Send everything to me by secure upload. I am placing a review hold on the final draw inspection until we verify the property. That afternoon, my father drove to my apartment without warning. I did not let him inside. We stood outside my door while he tried to turn fraud back into family. Avery, you don't understand construction finance. Rick was moving things around so both projects could stay efficient. I said, my loan is not a warehouse. He rubbed his forehead. Madison needed a start. You already had a house. I looked at him. I had a gutted bungalow and a loan balance. His face hardened. If the bank gets involved, they could freeze everything. They already did. He went pale. For the first time since I found the windows, he looked less like a father lecturing a daughter and more like a man realizing the paper trail had left the family driveway. My mother called 10 minutes after he left and cried about Madison's engagement, the wedding timeline, and how hard life had been for my sister. I listened until she said, "You can rebuild later, Avery. Madison needs this now." Then I ended the call. Not because I had no heart, but because I finally understood they were not asking for help. They were asking me to accept being robbed politely. Monday's bank inspection was no longer just an appointment. It was the first room where my family could not decide what the truth was supposed to sound like. The bank inspector arrived at Maple Bend Road on Monday morning at 9:03, wearing a gray jacket, work boots, and the expression of a man who had already seen too many construction lies before breakfast. His name was Leonard Price, and he did not shake hands like he was there to be friendly. He shook hands like he was confirming I existed. Karen Whitlock from Appalachian First Bank arrived 5 minutes later with a tablet and a folder, and Rick Donnelly pulled up last in his white contractor truck, smiling too widely. My father came with him, which told me everything. Nobody had invited him. He stood near the curb with his hands in his pockets, trying to look like a concerned parent instead of a man whose email said shifted resources. Karen looked at me first. Avery, thank you for sending the documents. Today we're verifying the collateral property only. Rick's smile flickered when she said only. Leonard walked the bungalow slowly. He did not need me to perform outrage for him. The house did that by itself. The old windows were still in place. The framing was incomplete. No roof dry-in work had been done. The rough electrical was half demolished and not ready for inspection. The plumbing wall was open, with no new lines installed. Leonard compared the bank's second draw photos to the actual rooms and kept making quiet notes. When he reached the kitchen, he held up one of the printed progress photos Rick had submitted and looked through the gutted wall toward my backyard. This is not the same property, he said. Rick stepped forward quickly. The photos were representative progress shots. Karen looked at him. Representative of what, Mr. Donnelly? This loan is tied to Maple Bend Road. Rick's mouth opened, then closed. My father tried to step in. There's been a scheduling misunderstanding. Materials were staged elsewhere because Avery's property had access issues. Leonard looked at the empty driveway, the clear street, and the side gate wide enough for a delivery truck. What access issues? My father blinked. Well, general timing issues. Karen turned to him. Mr. Lawson, Are you a borrower on this loan? His face tightened. I'm her father. Karen waited. That was not my question. He looked at me then, angry that the room had rules he did not write. No, he said, I am not. Karen made a note. That small gesture seemed to scare him more than any accusation. Rick tried to recover by claiming the materials were safely stored and would be moved to Maple Bend within the week. I asked, were those materials purchased with funds released from my second draw? He said, the draw was for Project Progress. Leonard answered before I could. There is no matching progress here. Karen opened the draw file on her tablet and scrolled. Mr. Donnelly, the invoice package and photos you submitted represented window staging, framing progress, and roof dry-in for this property. We now have county permit records showing similar progress at Cedar Hollow Lane under your contractor registration, with a material allocation sheet using Avery's project code. Rick's face lost color. My father said, Avery, this is getting out of hand. I said, no, it's finally in the right hands. After Maple Bend, Karen and Leonard asked to inspect Cedar Hollow Lane. Rick objected immediately, saying it was a separate private property. Karen said, then you can provide the material transfer records, refund documentation, and corrected draw package instead. Rick looked at my father. My father looked toward his truck. Neither of them had brought documents because they had spent the weekend preparing explanations, not proof. Karen called her bank supervisor from the sidewalk and then told us the review would continue with county records, supplier records, and any site access available through public inspection documentation. I did not need them to walk through Madison's house that morning. I already had enough photos, permit copies, delivery labels, and bank draw images to show where my money had gone. Madison arrived at Maple Bend just as the inspector was leaving. She got out of her car wearing sunglasses too large for her face and anger too polished to be natural. My mother had clearly sent her. Avery, are you seriously trying to get my house shut down? She asked. Karen paused near her car. Leonard kept writing. Rick stared at the ground. I looked at my sister and said, Your house was built with my loan. Madison laughed, but it cracked in the middle. You always make everything about money. That was almost impressive, considering she was standing beside a gutted house my money was supposed to repair. No, I said. I'm making this about records. She looked at Karen and said, My parents are handling it. Karen replied, Your parents are not parties to Avery's construction loan. Madison's mouth closed. Some sentences are boring until they ruin someone's plan. By noon, Appalachian First Bank officially froze all remaining draws and opened a construction loan misuse review. Karen sent written notice to Rick, my father, and me. Rick had to provide a full accounting of all funds, materials, labor hours, supplier invoices, delivery addresses, and subcontractor payments tied to my loan. No further payments would be issued until the bank verified work at Maple Bend. The notice also warned that false draw documentation could trigger contractor removal, demand for reimbursement, and possible referral to the bank's fraud department. My father called me within 5 minutes of receiving it. I let it go to voicemail. His message was short and furious. Avery, call me before you ruin this family over a timing issue. I saved it. Timing issue was becoming his favorite name for theft. That evening, Rick finally replied to my written request. His email said that certain materials had been temporarily staged at Cedar Hollow Lane due to logistics, and that my father had represented that both Lawson family projects were being managed under a shared family reimbursement arrangement. He attached no signed authorization from me, no revised contract, no bank approval, and no change order. Instead, he attached a spreadsheet labeled Resource Balancing, where my Maple Bend loan funds were used for windows, framing labor, wrap, underlayment, and rough-in scheduling at Cedar Hollow, with a note that Madison's future financing would reimburse Avery's project later. Later. That word sat on the page like a rotten beam. My house had been gutted now. My loan balance was real now. Madison's future financing was imaginary. I forwarded Rick's email to Karen and to a construction attorney named Elise Grant, whose office I had found through a colleague at the architectural firm. Elise called me 20 minutes later and said, "Do not speak to your contractor by phone again. Do not meet your parents alone. Do not sign anything they give you. And Avery, preserve every photo you took at Cedar Hollow." I asked her how bad it was. She said, "For you, fixable. For them, worse than they think." That was the first sentence all week that let me breathe. The next morning, Madison posted a photo on Instagram of herself and Evan standing in front of the framed Cedar Hollow house. The caption said, "Building our dream from the ground up. So grateful for family who shows up." I stared at it while sitting in my car outside work, and for a second, the unfairness hit so hard I could barely move. My family had taken the materials meant to make my house livable and turned them into a gratitude post. Then I noticed something in the background of the photo. A stack of wrapped siding with a supplier tag visible in the corner. I zoomed in. Same invoice number as my Maple Bend draw package. I took a screenshot, saved it, and sent it to Elise. Madison had not just posted her dream house. She had posted another receipt. By the end of that week, Madison's Instagram post had become part of the evidence file. Elise Grant, my attorney, printed it with the timestamp, the caption, the supplier tag enlarged, and the invoice number matched to my draw package. "People think social media is emotion," she said during our first meeting, sliding the page into a folder. "In cases like this, it is often a voluntary exhibit." I sat across from her with my renovation binder in my lap, feeling strangely calm as she reviewed the bank freeze notice, Rick's resource balancing spreadsheet, the county permit files, my father's shifted resources email, and the inspector's report confirming Maple Bend had none of the progress used to justify the second draw. Elise did not gasp or perform outrage. She simply circled the same 3 words again and again: unauthorized, misapplied, documented. Then she looked at me and said, "We are going to give them one chance to correct this before the bank decides whether it becomes something uglier." The demand letter went out the next morning to Rick Donnelly, my parents, Madison, and Madison's fiancé, Evan. It required a full accounting of every dollar drawn from my construction loan, immediate return or replacement of all materials purchased under my project code, suspension of all work at Cedar Hollow involving my funds, corrected invoices from every supplier, and a written statement confirming that I had never authorized a shared family reimbursement arrangement. It also warned that any attempt to pressure me privately would be documented and forwarded to the bank. My father ignored that part within 3 hours. He emailed me, not Elise, saying, "Avery, lawyers don't fix family problems. You're letting an outsider turn a temporary arrangement into an attack on your mother and sister." I forwarded it to Elise without responding. She replied, "Good. Silence is doing excellent work for you." Madison reacted worse. She showed up at my office lobby during lunch, crying loudly enough that 2 interns looked up from the material library. I walked downstairs and found her standing beside the reception desk with perfect makeup, trembling hands, and the kind of tears that arrived ready for witnesses. "How could you do this to me?" she asked before I said a word. I looked at the receptionist, then at Madison. "This is my workplace." She lowered her voice, but not by much. "You're trying to get my house taken away." "Madison, your house is being built with my loan." She wiped her cheek. "Mom and Dad said it would be paid back. Evan and I were going to refinance after the wedding. You just had to wait." I stared at her, finally hearing the truth underneath all the family noise. They had never planned to ask me. They had planned to finish her house first, hope her financing came through later, and leave my gutted bungalow as a problem for future Avery to solve. I asked Madison whether Evan knew the materials came from my loan. Her face changed. Not enough for strangers to notice, but enough for me. "Evan knows Dad was helping us," she said. "That's not what I asked." Her tears stopped for half a second. "Why are you being so cruel?" I almost answered the old way, explaining myself, softening the facts until she could stand near them. Instead, I said, "Any further communication goes through a lease." Madison's mouth tightened. "You're really choosing a house over your sister?" I looked at her for a long moment. "No. You chose your house over mine." Then I walked back upstairs before she could turn the lobby into a stage. That afternoon, Evan called me from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something told me to answer and say nothing first. He sounded less angry than scared. "Avery, I need to know how much of our build is tied to your loan." I looked at my computer screen, where Elise had just sent me a revised accounting request. "You should ask your contractor and your fiancé." He exhaled. "Madison told me your parents were gifting some materials because your renovation timeline got pushed back. She said you knew." There it was again. You knew. The family's favorite imaginary signature. I said, "I did not know, and I did not authorize it." Evan went quiet. "The bank froze your draw." "Yes." "Could they freeze our site too?" I said. "If your site contains materials purchased with misapplied loan funds, that is a question for your attorney." He whispered a curse, then hung up. 10 minutes later, Madison texted me. "You had no right to scare Evan." I forwarded that too. Rick missed the first deadline in Elise's demand letter. Then he missed the second. Appalachian First Bank did not. Karen Whitlock sent formal notice that Rick was suspended from further draw eligibility on my loan, pending investigation. She also required an independent cost-to-complete estimate for Maple Bend because the bank now had to determine how much of the original renovation budget was gone and how much remained to make the collateral livable. That word, collateral, hurt more than I expected. To me, Maple Bend was the bungalow with the drafting nook I had imagined, the porch I wanted to restore, the first place that would be mine without anyone else's permission. To the bank, it was collateral. To my family, it had been a funding source. I was the only person who had treated it like a home. The cost-to-complete inspection happened 2 days later with a new contractor, a woman named Teresa Holt, who had no church friendship with my father and no patience for vague explanations. She walked through Maple Bend with a clipboard and said, "Whoever billed progress on this house was not standing in this house." She confirmed the obvious demolition was incomplete. Framing had barely started. Windows were missing. Roof work had not been performed. And several roughened materials listed as paid were not on site. Her estimate showed that restoring the project would cost at least $47,000 more than the remaining loan funds because so much money had been spent elsewhere. I did not cry until I got home. Not because I was surprised, but because a number makes loss feel official. The next day, my father sent one more email. This time, copying my mother, Madison, Evan, Rick, and, accidentally or arrogantly, Elise. He wrote, "Everyone needs to calm down. Avery's project can be delayed without serious harm. Madison and Evan have a wedding deadline and more immediate housing needs. We always intended to reimburse Avery after their financing closed. This should have stayed in the family." Elise called me 5 minutes later and said, "Your father just admitted priority, knowledge, and lack of authorization in the same paragraph." I looked at the email again, and for the first time, I did not hear my father's authority in it. I heard evidence. By Friday afternoon, the bank escalated the file to its construction risk department. Rick received notice that his contractor approval status with Appalachian First Bank was under review. The suppliers were instructed to preserve delivery records. Madison and Evan's site was flagged for material ownership dispute. My parents stopped calling me directly after Elise sent a no-contact letter. For one quiet evening, my phone did not ring. I drove to Maple Bend near sunset and stood on the cracked front porch, looking through the old windows that should have been replaced weeks ago. The house looked wounded, but still standing. I put my hand on the door frame and whispered, "I'm sorry." Not because I had done anything wrong, but because nobody else had apologized to it either. The construction risk meeting happened the following Tuesday at Appalachian First Bank, and nobody in my family wanted it to happen there. My father asked Elise if we could meet somewhere more comfortable. My mother suggested their dining room, because apparently a room with family photos and her good china would make misused loan funds feel less official. Elise declined both offers. "This is a bank matter," she said, "so it will be handled at the bank." That was how I ended up sitting in a glass conference room beside my attorney, across from my parents, Madison, Evan, Rick Donnelly, Karen Whitlock, Leonard Price, and a construction risk manager named Paul Mercer, who spoke in the calm voice of someone used to watching people realize paperwork had teeth. Paul opened the meeting by placing 3 folders on the table: Maple Bend Road, Cedar Hollow Lane, and Loan Disbursement Review. My father stared at the folders like they were rude guests. Karen began with the bank's findings. The second draw from my Maple Bend loan had been approved based on photos and invoices representing work that did not exist at my property. Materials purchased under my project code had been delivered or staged at Cedar Hollow Lane. Contractor labor billed under my renovation appeared in scheduling records for Madison's build. The county permit file showed no matching progress at Maple Bend, while Cedar Hollow had framing, roof dry-in, temporary power, and material allocation using identifiers tied to my loan. Karen did not accuse anyone of a crime in that room. She did not have to. She simply read the facts in order. Every time my mother tried to interrupt with, "We intended," or "The family understood," Paul lifted one hand and said, "We will get to explanations after the records." I had never heard a sentence more beautiful. Rick went first because contractors understand banks better than parents do. He admitted that materials had been temporarily reallocated, but claimed he believed I had authorized a family arrangement through my father. Elise asked for the written authorization. Rick looked down. Paul asked for a change order, listing Cedar Hollow as a secondary storage or work site. Rick did not have one. Karen asked why progress photos from Cedar Hollow were submitted under the Maple Bend draw package. Rick said his office may have attached the wrong images. Leonard, the inspector, opened his folder and said, "The invoice package also matched those images." "That is not a single photo attachment error." Rick's face turned gray. My father leaned forward and said, "Rick was trying to help both girls." Elise replied, "Only one of those girls was the borrower." Madison cried when her turn came, but the tears worked differently in a bank conference room. There were no aunts to comfort her, no family friends to glare at me, no kitchen table where my mother could rewrite the scene. Madison said she thought my parents were gifting materials, that Evan's financing delay was temporary, and that she believed I knew because Avery always helps family when it matters. I looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw not innocence, but entitlement wearing innocence's sweater. Evan sat beside her with his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. When Paul asked if he knew the materials were tied to my construction loan, he said quietly, "No." I was told Daniel and Linda were helping us bridge costs until our loan closed. Madison turned toward him, wounded. "Evan?" He did not look at her. "I'm not lying to a bank for your parents." That was the first crack inside Madison's side of the table. My mother reached for my sister's hand, and my father shifted into his lecture voice. "This has become much more dramatic than necessary. Avery's project was not abandoned. It was delayed. Madison had an immediate housing timeline because of the wedding. We were going to reimburse Avery as soon as Madison and Evan's financing closed." Paul asked, "Was Madison's financing approved?" My father hesitated. Evan answered, "No." Paul looked at my parents. "So the reimbursement depended on a loan that did not exist yet." My mother whispered, "It was going to work out." Elise said, "For whom?" Nobody answered. Then Karen showed the cost to complete estimate. Teresa Holt's report confirmed that Maple Bend needed at least $47,000 beyond remaining loan funds to reach the stage already represented in the second draw. That number sat in the room like a judge. My mother covered her mouth and finally looked at me, not with apology, but with the shock of seeing my loss quantified. My father tried to say the family could make payments over time. Elise stopped him. "Avery is not financing your repayment plan while her loan accrues interest and her house remains unlivable." Paul explained the bank's proposed corrective path. Rick would be removed from the Maple Bend project. The bank would pursue recovery or reversal of improperly documented disbursements where possible. Suppliers would identify which materials belonged to my loan, and Cedar Hollow would remain flagged until ownership and payment issues were resolved. No additional work tied to disputed materials could continue without written clearance. Madison's face went white. "So my house just stops?" Karen answered. "Your house is not the collateral property for Avery's loan." Madison looked at me, and for 1 second, I thought she might finally understand. Instead, she said, "You're really okay ruining my wedding." I felt something in me close, gently but permanently. "Madison, you stood in front of my windows and told me I could wait because you were getting married. You don't get to call the consequences a wedding problem now." Evan stood up halfway, then sat back down, like he wanted distance from that sentence and from her at the same time. The meeting ended with written directives. Rick had 10 business days to provide complete accounting, refund proposals, subcontractor logs, and supplier confirmations. My parents were instructed not to contact vendors, inspectors, or bank staff outside the formal review. Madison and Evan were told their site could not use any disputed materials until ownership was resolved. I was given approval to solicit a replacement contractor under bank oversight, with Teresa Holt invited to submit a recovery bid. Before we left, Paul looked at my father and said, "Mr. Lawson, any future communication suggesting Avery authorized this arrangement must include signed documentation from Avery. If none exists, do not repeat that claim." My father looked humiliated. Not sorry. Humiliated. There is a difference. In the parking lot, my mother tried one last time. She caught up to me while Elise was putting files in her car and said, "Avery, please. Madison is falling apart. Evan may call off the wedding." I looked past her at my sister sitting in Evan's car, crying into her hands while he stared straight ahead. "Then Madison should tell him the truth." My mother's eyes filled. "You're being cold." I almost laughed. For weeks, they had treated my house, my loan, my credit, and my future like spare parts for Madison's dream. But I was cold because I would not keep warming my hands over the fire they set. "No," I said. "I'm being billed." My mother flinched, and I walked away before she could turn that into a speech about family pain. That evening, Evan emailed me with a lease copied. It was short. He confirmed he had not known my loan funds were being used, agreed to preserve all Cedar Hollow records, and stated that he would not participate in further construction until disputed materials were identified. Madison called me 6 times after that. I did not answer. Then she texted, "You got what you wanted. Evan thinks I trapped him." I forwarded it to Elise and sat on the floor of my apartment for a long time, surrounded by permit copies, bank letters, and photos of a house that should have been mine by spring. I did not feel victorious. I felt tired. But under the tiredness was something stronger than relief. The lie was no longer moving forward. For the first time, it had to stand still and be measured. Teresa Holt's recovery bid arrived 3 days later, and it was the first construction document in weeks that did not feel like a trap. She broke Maple Bend into clean phases: secure the site, correct framing, replace missing windows, dry the roof, redo rough electrical planning, and rebuild the bank draw schedule from verified work only. Her estimate was blunt. The project could be saved, but not on the original budget unless the misapplied funds were returned quickly. Appalachian First Bank approved Teresa as the replacement contractor under enhanced inspection requirements, which meant every draw would need verified photos, county permit confirmation, and direct inspector approval before money moved. I signed the new contractor agreement with a hand that shook a little, not from fear, but from the exhaustion of finally signing something that protected me instead of pretending to. Rick's accounting came in 2 days before his deadline, and it was worse than anyone expected. Windows, framing labor, roof wrap, underlayment, exterior sheathing, and part of the rough electrical prep had been billed to Maple Bend but used at Cedar Hollow. Some supplier invoices had been edited to remove delivery addresses before being uploaded to the bank portal. 2 subcontractors had been paid from my draw while working on Madison's house. Rick blamed administrative confusion, but Leonard Price's inspection notes and the county permit file made that impossible to sell. Karen Whitlock called it a material discrepancy. Elise called it conversion of funds. Paul Mercer from Construction Risk called it grounds for contractor removal and recovery demand. My father called it a misunderstanding until Elise forwarded him the edited invoice copies side by side with supplier originals. After that, he stopped using words and started asking about payment plans. The settlement meeting was not at my parents' house, even though my mother tried again. It happened in Elise's office with Karen on video, Rick's attorney present, Evan attending with his own counsel, and my parents sitting beside Madison as if proximity could still make their version true. Elise opened with the numbers. To restore my project to the stage falsely represented in the second draw, the responsible parties needed to cover $47,000 in cost to complete gap, replace or return all traceable materials, reimburse bank review fees, and pay for new inspection and permit correction costs. Rick's attorney tried to argue that Cedar Hollow had benefited from only temporary staging, but Evan's counsel interrupted and said his client would not support that characterization. Madison turned toward Evan like he had slapped her. He did not look back. "I will not sign a false statement," he said quietly. That sentence did more damage to Madison than anything I had said. My father finally admitted the structure out loud, though he wrapped it in the language of sacrifice. He said they had intended to bridge Madison's build because her wedding timeline was tighter and because my bungalow was not immediately needed for occupancy. Elise asked whether I had agreed to that bridge. He looked at the table. My mother said, "Not formally." Elise replied, "Not at all." Madison started crying then, saying everyone was acting like she was some criminal when she had only trusted her parents. I looked at her and remembered her standing beside my windows, telling me I could wait because she was getting married. "You knew enough," I said. She wiped her face and whispered, "You always land on your feet." For years, that had been my family's excuse for taking from me. Because I could recover, I was expected to absorb the fall. This time, I let the silence answer her. The final settlement was not perfect, but it was enforceable. Rick agreed to refund a portion of his contractor fee, cover specific rework costs, and surrender all Maple Bend project documents to Teresa. His approval status with Appalachian First Bank remained suspended, pending final review, and suppliers were notified that future invoices under my project had to include verified delivery addresses. My parents agreed to pay the cost to complete gap in 2 installments, secured by a signed promissory note and lien against their home equity line. Madison and Evan's Cedar Hollow project remained frozen until disputed materials were either purchased properly, returned, or credited back. Evan agreed to separate his finances from Madison's build until the dispute cleared. Madison refused to sign the first draft because it made her look guilty. Elise changed one sentence from Madison knowingly accepted to Madison received benefit from, and even then, she signed like the pen had insulted her. After the meeting, my mother followed me into the hallway. She looked smaller than usual, but I no longer trusted smallness as proof of regret. "Avery," she said, "I know you think we chose Madison over you." I turned around. "You did." Her eyes filled. "We thought you were stronger." That sentence hurt because it was probably the closest she had ever come to telling the truth. They had not thought I needed less. They had thought I would survive more, I said. "Being stronger does not make me available." She covered her mouth and started crying, but I did not hug her. I had spent my whole life translating her tears into my responsibility. That day, I let them remain hers. Work restarted at Maple Bend the following Monday. Teresa's crew arrived at 7:30 with labeled materials, a printed schedule, and a site log posted inside the front door. The old windows came out first. When the new black-framed windows were finally installed in my actual house, I stood in the front yard and watched sunlight hit the glass like the place had opened its eyes. It was not finished. The porch was still cracked. The kitchen still needed framing corrections, and the bank still required extra inspections because of what Rick had done. But the work was happening where it was supposed to happen, under my name, on my property, with my approval. That should not have felt revolutionary, but after weeks of watching my family treat my future like storage space, it did. Madison's wedding fell apart before her house did. Evan did not make a public scene. He simply postponed the engagement, moved back into his apartment, and told my parents he would not marry into a financial mess built on someone else's loan. Madison blamed me, of course. She sent one long message saying I had humiliated her, destroyed her timeline, poisoned Evan against her, and ruined the happiest season of her life. I read it once and deleted it. Not forwarded, not archived, not answered. Elise had enough evidence. I did not need to keep every wound. Some messages are not documentation. They are just people screaming because the mirror finally works. By the end of the month, the first repayment installment cleared. Appalachian First Bank applied it to the corrected Maple Bend budget, and Teresa adjusted the draw schedule. Karen emailed me a clean status update. Maple Bend recovery plan active. Contractor replaced. Account current. Enhanced inspection requirements satisfied for next phase. I printed that email and placed it in my renovation binder, not because it was dramatic, but because it was the first official document that described my house as recoverable. That evening, I drove to Maple Bend after sunset, unlocked the front door, and stood inside the dark living room. Through the new windows, the streetlights reflected in clean glass. For the first time since I bought the bungalow, I could see myself in it. Maple Bend was finished 9 months later. Not in the spring like I had planned, but in early autumn, when the maple tree in the front yard turned orange around the edges and the porch finally stopped looking like a wound. Teresa Holt's crew did not work fast, but they worked clean. Every invoice had a delivery address. Every draw had matching inspection photos. Every change order had my signature and nobody else's. The new black-framed windows caught the afternoon light exactly the way I had imagined when I first bought the bungalow, back when I thought the hardest part would be choosing tile on a budget. The drafting nook went into the old laundry room, just as planned, with a narrow desk under a window and shelves for rolled drawings. The kitchen was smaller than Madison's dream layout, but it was mine. And after everything that had happened, mine felt bigger than luxury. My parents made both settlement payments, though not gracefully. The first came through after the bank threatened further action. The second arrived 2 days before the deadline, followed by an email from my father saying he hoped I understood the financial strain this had placed on everyone. I did not answer. Elise told me I did not need to. Rick lost his approval status with Appalachian First Bank and 2 other local lenders after the review circulated through their contractor network. He did not lose his business overnight, but he lost the easy trust that had let him walk into families and banks with a smile and a handshake. Madison's Cedar Hollow project sat half-finished through most of the summer, while ownership of materials and unpaid balances were sorted out. The black-framed windows that had originally belonged to me were either paid for properly or replaced on my budget. Every piece had to be accounted for. That was the part my family hated most. Not the money, the accounting. Madison did not marry Evan that spring. Their engagement did not end with a public fight or a dramatic confession. It ended quietly. The way things end when one person finally reads the paperwork and realizes love has been standing too close to fraud. Evan sent me one email months later, copied to Elise, saying he had resolved his portion of Cedar Hollow separately and was sorry for what happened. I believed him enough not to resent him. Madison sent nothing that could be called an apology. She posted vague quotes about betrayal, jealous women, and protecting your peace from people who can't celebrate you. For a while, relatives liked those posts and avoided looking me in the eye at the grocery store. Then the settlement became family knowledge. Evan moved on, and Madison's version got harder to repeat without sounding ridiculous. My mother tried to visit Maple Bend before I moved in. She came on a Sunday afternoon, carrying a potted fern and a face full of careful sadness. I met her on the porch, but did not invite her inside. That boundary was not dramatic. It was simply locked. She looked through the new windows, the ones she had once allowed to sit beside Madison's garage, and said, "It turned out beautiful." I said, "Yes, it did." She waited for more, but I had learned that silence is not emptiness just because someone else wants to fill it. Finally, she said, "Avery, I know mistakes were made." I looked at her then. Mistakes are wrong paint colors. This was a construction loan. Her mouth trembled. "We thought you would recover." I nodded slowly. That was the problem. You used my strength as permission. My father came by a week later, but only because Teresa was still finishing the porch rail, and he probably thought a contractor's presence would keep the conversation polite. He stood in the yard, hands in his pockets, and said the house looked solid. Coming from him, that was almost emotion. I thanked him. He cleared his throat and said, "I should have handled things differently." I waited. Differently was not the same as honestly. He looked toward the porch, then at the ground. "I should not have used your project to cover Madison's delay." It was the closest he had come to naming it. I said, "No, you shouldn't have." He looked wounded that I did not make the moment easier for him. But I was done doing finish work on other people's apologies. I moved into Maple Bend on a Saturday with 3 friends from work, 2 rented dollies, and 1 pizza order that arrived cold because nobody could find the new house number in the dark. We laughed anyway. We put my drafting table in the nook, my books in the living room, and a small blue chair on the porch that I had bought before the renovation went wrong. That night, after everyone left, I sat on the floor in the kitchen with a paper plate in my lap and listened to the house settle around me. It did not feel perfect. It felt earned. Every clean wall, every working outlet, every window that actually belonged in its frame carried the memory of a fight I should never have had to win. But the house was no longer evidence. It was home. I did not forgive Madison. I did not cut her off with an announcement either. I simply stopped being available for the role she had always assigned me. When she texted months later, asking if I would please talk like sisters, I replied once, "I am willing to talk when you are ready to acknowledge that your house was built with funds from my loan without my consent." She did not respond. That was an answer. My parents still invited me to holidays, and sometimes I went for an hour, drove myself, and left before old patterns could find a chair beside me. My mother cried less when she realized tears no longer opened doors. Sterile spoke more carefully when he realized I saved emails. The real revenge was not Madison's wedding falling apart, or Rick losing lender approval, or my parents signing a repayment note secured against their own home equity. Those were consequences, and consequences matter. But the revenge was quieter than that. It was waking up in Maple Bend on the first cold morning of winter, making coffee in the kitchen I paid to rebuild, and watching sunlight come through the black-framed windows that my family once thought I would never reclaim. It was sitting at my drafting desk and taking on a side project for a young couple renovating their first home, then writing one line into my contract because I had learned it the hard way: no third-party authorization without written borrower approval. Pain became policy. Betrayal became a clause. My house became a boundary with a roof. Avery's story taught me that theft inside a family does not always look like someone breaking a lock. Sometimes it looks like temporary, shared, "we'll pay you back, and you can wait." Sometimes the people who call you selfish are only angry because you stopped letting them spend your future on someone else's dream. But loans have names, permits have addresses, invoices have delivery records, and the truth has a way of standing exactly where the work was supposed to be done. If your family ever asks you to be patient while they benefit from your loss, ask for the paperwork. If they say not to involve the bank, ask why the bank would disagree with the truth. And if they tell you that love means waiting quietly while they build someone else's life with your foundation, remember this: a home is not selfish just because it belongs to you.